2024 was a really interesting year in trans representation, especially when you take into account how many things came out that were made with heavy influence or primarily by trans creators. And I'm stuck talking about Emilia Perez. Yeah, I don't really want to talk about this movie, but I kind of have to. Because, it's already won a whole bunch of awards, and on the day that I'm filming this, the Oscar nominations came out. And there's a lot. To run it down real quick, Emilia Perez is nominated for Best Performance by an Actress in both the lead and supporting role categories. Best International Film, Achievement in Directing, Achievement in Cinematography, Achievement in Editing, Achievement in Makeup and Hair, Achievement in Sound, Best Original Score, 2 entries in the Best Original Song category, Best Adapted Screenplay, and of course, Best Picture. In case you weren't counting as I went through that, that's 13. That means that it is tied for the second most nominations of any film, along with the likes of Oppenheimer, Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring, Gone with the Wind, Mary Poppins, Chicago, and The Shape of Water. And to save the curious folks of Google, the most nominated films is a 3-way tie between La La Land, Titanic, and All About Eve. At this point, if I were a betting person, and reminder, I have historically been a betting person when it comes to the Oscars, and I have in fact won my local Oscar pool twice, actually, one time tying with somebody else. But for my money, it's practically a shoe-in for makeup, lead actress, song, screenplay, sound, director, and best picture. And out of those that I am at this point expecting it to win, I would say it deserves 1, 2 at a stretch. And I don't mean deserves the award, I mean deserves the nomination. But of course, the thing is, the Oscars have never actually been about what deserves to be awarded. They've never been about merit, not entirely. They have, especially in the last 30 years or so, been also very heavily about optics. And the optics are that this year, roughly a month and a half after Trump began signing his executive orders intended to suppress and erase trans people as much as possible, the voters for the Academy Awards can give themselves a massive pat on the back by handing out awards to a film with a lead actually played by a trans actress, and thereby attempting to nullify and move on from nominations and awards in the past that went to cisgender people who played trans characters, something I've talked about a couple of times already, including pretty recently. And as I noted in that most recent video, I am happy that the industry appears to be moving away from that practice and has moved away from it, but it does still have those past nominations and awards kind of staining its record at the moment. Hollywood is going to feel so good about itself for awarding this film at this time. It's a shame the movie sucks and the representation is bad, but, there I go, spoiling a perfectly serviceable circle jerk. Yeah, look, sorry to rain on the party, but Emilia Perez is not a good movie. And that is not an opinion that I'm happy about holding, to be clear. I don't like that at first glance I appear to be holding a similar overall quality assessment as the likes of Ben Shapiro and other right-wing shitheads. That having been said, also not my first rodeo. I do have a bit of experience of finding myself disliking a movie at the same time that a whole bunch of people who I massively disagree with also dislike it. I didn't like Ghostbusters 2016. I didn't like The Last Jedi. But in those instances, as with this one, the people who I don't want to be associated with, who are also crapping all over this movie, they hate it for distinctly different and frequently deeply bigoted reasons. So I'm just going to have to suck up the fact that I held a negative view at the same time that a bunch of people I don't like are also holding a negative view, and just take comfort in the fact that I've got very different complaints from what they do. I didn't jump on watching this movie right away, and honestly, when I did get around to it, I would have liked to have found value in the movie, and there is a little bit, But ultimately, the fact that it's going to get a bunch of Oscars basically just for existing at all, and this is happening in a year of such brilliant trans-focused work as I Saw the TV Glow, yeah, that don't sit right, really at all. All right, so in the interest of not trying to just 100% crap on this and be totally negative all the time, because trust me, I don't like the tone that a lot of my recent videos have taken, but this is the stuff I'm dealing with right now, so it is what it is. But let's get some positivity in there. And pretty much all the positivity is going to tie back in some way to the lead actress, Carla Sofia Gascon. First things first, for what the part is asking of her, she does a good job. And there is one specific thing that I will always be legitimately grateful to this movie for doing. Because this is a movie that not only has a trans character as its primary focus, but it also depicts that character both pre and post-transition. And back when it was far more common to cast cisgender people in trans roles, one of the defenses I would often see, I see it less now, but it's because the practice has died down, but one of those defenses was, well, when they show a character before they transition, obviously you have to get like a cisgender man to play a trans woman in that case, because it wouldn't be convincing otherwise. I now get to point to this movie and the fact that Gascon is playing the same character pre and post transition, doing the exact thing that I said 6 years ago was the solution to that supposed defense of casting cisgender men to play trans women, which is all that makeup and prosthetics that you used to put on cisgender man to make them look more trans. Just use that same makeup magic to make a trans person look like they are still their assigned gender at birth. And this movie does it, and it is convincing. It sells it well. I am so happy that I get to actually point at an example that this has been done and it works, because up to this point, I've largely had to talk about it as a hypothetical. So I am legitimately happy about that. And I did say that there was at least one award that I think this thing actually deserved. Makeup's the big one, honestly. And the other one that I think, okay, yeah, sure, is Gascon's own performance. Because while I am going to be saying some not great things about the character, she does put in a lot of work playing her. And much like I could admit I didn't like the original Joker movie, Joaquin Phoenix still worked his ass off. I can give the same grace to Gascon in this. As for the rest of the actors in it, they are fine. Everybody is doing solid work for what it is they're asked to do. I would say Gascon is by far the standout, but nobody's giving a bad performance. And, yeah, that's about it as far as praise goes. Sorry to say. Now, before I get into my issues with this thing as a piece of trans representation, I'm also going to acknowledge the existence of another area of heavy criticism that I'm not going to take up for reasons that will become pretty obvious in a minute, but I do still think is worth acknowledging. This movie, set in Mexico, about primarily Mexican characters, was written and directed by a Frenchman, filmed in France, and starring as its three primary leads are one Spanish woman and two Americans. And it has met with a lot of criticism from Mexico and Mexican critics, both for some of the specifics of the depiction of the country, as well as a lack of Mexican talent, both in front of and behind the camera. Shout out to Adriana Paz as the only member of the core cast who is actually from Mexico. Now, I'm not knowledgeable enough about Mexico in terms of history, culture, or anything else to really get into those criticisms. I feel like it's not my place necessarily to try and make them on other people's behalf. But I am going to acknowledge that they are out there. So if you're keeping track, this movie, primarily about a trans woman in Mexico, so the two major things it's representing are trans people and Mexico. And the two main focuses of criticism have been about its depiction of trans people and Mexico, with those criticisms coming from trans people and Mexicans. Maybe that should have been a flag. Yeah, the Oscars don't care, do they? But while I can't necessarily speak for a Mexican perspective, if it is at all like the trans perspective, I do feel comfortable in saying that it really does feel like writer-director Jacques Audiard didn't really know what he was talking about when it came to apparently most of what's up on the screen. But all right, narrowing it down to the trans representation that is in this. I am going to go over kind of the bullet points, but I'm not going to go into it as deeply as you might have been expecting. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that there are other people out there who either already have or are going to be releasing much more thorough examinations of the trans representation in specific. Again, I will go over some things, but honestly, it's the kind of representation that you need some context for to fully understand why it's bad, because it's the sort of thing that on paper, if you yourself are not trans or are not in community with trans people, you may not realize why these aren't good things. But I don't really feel like giving the full context, though again, I will sort of bullet point them, because, well, for one thing, my good friend Jessie Gender is going to be covering it way more thoroughly. That video is coming out relatively soon. I've seen the script. She's going to explain that a lot more thoroughly and honestly better than I ever could. But also the other thing is, while the trans representation frustrated me, I actually find that to be the less interesting problem to talk about, personally. But we are still going to cover it because it's not good. Now, I already said that if you yourself are not trans or in good community with trans people, you might not recognize a lot of these problems. But I'll tell you what, if you are either of those things, you probably came away with a very distinct feeling of going, wow, that really felt like a cisgender person trying to write trans people. Because, yeah, you can feel that. And that is not to invalidate either the idea of cis people writing trans people or even that perspective. It's okay for something to depict the perspective that cis people have on trans people in theory. It's just that when it comes to, the big major recognized things, that's the dominant perspective granted, whereas the stuff we actually make about ourselves becomes niche and cult and doesn't get anywhere near the recognition. But yeah, there's a lot about this perspective that is frankly just rooted in the fact that he's cisgender, and that was the perspective he brought to it. And it's the same perspective that most recognized movies about trans people have. Now, as I said, I'm not going to fully break down all the context and kind of history of depictions that you might need to fully thoroughly understand why this is a problem, but here's some bullet points that I hope people will understand. I've already described the overall feel we get. Let's talk about what contributes to that. Well, it starts with the fact that Emilia isn't the perspective character. Zoe Saldana's character of Rita is the perspective character. And that's not to say the movie isn't about Emilia, but literally by design, it is about a character observing Emilia more than it is actually about Emilia. Everything is filtered through the cisgender woman who is meant to share the perspective of the audience. So that audience isn't really meant to identify with and relate to Emilia directly. They are meant to identify with and relate to Rita, the cis person seeing her. And that creates an innate and inherent distance from the actual trans person because everything we see is being filtered through the perspective of the cisgender character that we're actually following. And then there is how medicalized the depiction and view of trans people is in this movie. And it's really pronounced. There is a massive focus put on surgeries and using them basically as the primary marker of being trans. Now, if you're not familiar with the terms trans medicalist, that is a thing that actually even exists within the trans community, and it's something I have spoken out against before on my other channel, the Vera Wild channel, where I talk pretty much exclusively about my own gender fluid experiences, as well as doing some product reviews. But over there, I've talked about the harm that a trans medicalist lens and how narrowly that tries to define what trans people are and why that is harmful. And this has a very medicalized view. The transmedicalist view basically amounts to if you haven't had hormones and surgeries, or at least want to get them, you're not really trans. And as I said, while that is a view that frustratingly does exist within some parts of the trans community, it is, in my experience at least, a minority of the trans community who actually holds those views. However, they are extremely commonly reflected when cisgender people talk about us, ask us questions, or try to depict us. The film's first act is all about Rita trying to secure surgeries for Emilia. Of course, this is after a still masculine presenting Emilia proves that she's trans by exposing her developing breast to Rita. And thankfully, those are not shown to the audience, so it is a little bit less exploitative and sleazy than it could have been in that particular respect. That having been said, it is still amounting to look at the ways I have physically altered my body. That is how I prove and define that I am in fact trans. Now, here's something that's worth remembering. Not all trans people even want hormones or surgeries. While I myself am on hormones and have been for about 5 years now, I have never had surgeries. I don't want surgeries, any. Not facial feminization, not a tracheal shave, not bottom surgery, none of it. I have no interest in any of it. The only surgery I've ever had in my entire life was getting a vasectomy, which ultimately I could have just skipped if I'd realized I was going to go on hormones, because being on estrogen for as long as I have would have sterilized me anyways. But that's literally the only surgery I've ever had in my entire life. And I have no interest in the kinds of surgeries that this thing is fixated on. And while I myself am on hormones, I don't have to be in order to be a trans person. Another reminder, in my specific case, at least, I don't claim to be a trans woman. I am gender fluid, but anyways. There is actually more emphasis put on the surgeries in this movie than the story even requires. More on that in a bit. And we literally have transmedicalist talking points being put forward by the doctor who conducts the surgeries. And again, this is all really common, and as frustrating as it is to see, it's also at least a little bit understandable that it is the thing that cisgender people tend to fixate on, whether they are talking about us, trying to represent us, or asking us questions. And despite that kind of focus on like the surgeries and the logistics of transition kind of make you feel a little bit like a sideshow attraction, it is understandable because a lot of people, when finding out about what transgender even is for the first time, most of their questions, yeah, they end up being surgery related. Usually just boiling down to, wait, what's currently in your pants? And has it changed or is it going to? Which is an understandable curiosity, but also, doesn't feel great and isn't terrific as a primary focus. Even as I can understand that it's where the cisgender mind tends to go first, it's real frustrating to see as a depiction because, maybe move on from that fixation. I get that to an outsider, the physical changes to the body are the things that grab the immediate attention, but excessively fixating on them while claiming to represent us reduces us down to just being about whether or not we've had the surgery yet, despite the fact that many can't, and more than a few flat out don't want to. Hi, that's me. Oh, and this scene, right?
Man to woman.
From penis to vagina.
It kind of went around the internet, became a little bit of a meme, especially on TikTok. And that's probably partially because in addition to being obviously hilariously bad, it's also one of the only extended sequences in English. Here's the thing about this scene. It has no reason to be there as far as the narrative is concerned. The only reason it exists is to just rattle off a list of surgeries. I'm not exaggerating. There is no other reason that this is here.
Mammoplasty.
Yes.
Vaginoplasty.
Yes.
Rhinoplasty.
Yes.
Laryngoplasty.
Yes.
The listing off of all these potential surgeries like their menu options at a restaurant literally has no reason to be here other than just highlighting the spectacle of it. Literally making a spectacle out of the idea of all these surgeries. But the thing is, Emilia doesn't get her sex change operation here. Literally none of these people are ever in the film again. This isn't the facility she goes to. These aren't the doctors who treat her. There's no reason for this. It contributes nothing to the story at all. It's a complete tangent. It's a complete diversion. And it serves no purpose other than to just go, holy crap, look at all the ways trans people can pay to have someone reshape their bodies. Isn't that crazy? And even for all the focus on medicalization and the medical aspects of transition, it also gets some stuff fundamentally, just flatly, factually wrong. Like, all right, I haven't really talked about the plot. I'm not going to very much, to be honest. It's not a plot I feel is worth going over point for point. But the core thing here is that Emilia Perez used to be a Mexican cartel head. She has transitioned into a whole new life. She is no longer directly involved in the cartel stuff at all. But she also faked her own death prior to the transition. So she had, when she was living as a family, a wife and 2 kids who were initially sent away. And then once she is settled, Emilia is settled in her new life in Mexico, she invites them back posing as her own cousin to help them out so that she can be close to her kids again. And one of the results of this is a scene where I believe it was the younger of these 2 kids cuddles up to her and says,
Hueles como mi papá.
"No, Jacques, no, she doesn't." If you weren't aware, a massive part of your scent, your body odor, sorry to use the more crass term for it, is determined by your hormone makeup, the nature of your skin, and your sweat and pheromones, all of which are impacted by being on a hormone regimen. By this point, Emilia has been on hormones for years, and it alters your body chemistry to the point that your skin quality changes, your sweat glands change, and yeah, you flat out do not smell the same. It is a near physiological impossibility that this many years on hormones that she smells like she did when she was a man. And if you haven't seen the movie and are going to defend this as being like, well, maybe it's more about like, oh, you smell like my father because she's still doing the same kind of stuff. You know, if this isn't the case with Emilia, but in theory, if like Papa went and like worked in the fields a lot, and if she's still doing this, she'll still smell like the fields, and that smells like Papa. Yeah, that doesn't track either because she completely changed the kind of lifestyle she was living. Yeah, sure, the kid lists off a bunch of stuff that seems like it fits that, but she's not living the same life, so none of that actually applies. Not to mention there's an emphasis on sweat on the back end, which is one of the things that absolutely would not smell the same. And I shouldn't even have to argue this because there was no reason to make it smell in the first place. The kid could have recognized certain mannerisms, the smile, heck, just a certain twinkle in the eye. You could have been nice and vague about it, but no, you picked smell specifically. There is no reason that she would smell the same other than to reinforce the idea that underneath all of this, she's still fundamentally a man in ways that are identifiable by a child sniffing her. You may have noticed that one ticked me off a fair bit. So to get through a few other things about the trans representation, I could get into things like how pre-transition Emilia was originally going to be played by a cis man until Gascon actually objected to that and insisted she get to do it. I could bring up the fact that at least from the interview she's given, that appears to be far more about having a strong sense of ownership over the character, and she does not appear to have ever brought up the idea of how that would be harmful representation for it to be played by a man, but the end result is still a good thing, and it gave us that one thing that I am going to be thankful to the movie forever for. So we'll move past that. I could get into how Gascon appears to have gone out of her way to not even engage with the criticism from the trans community, because she seems to think that people's problem with Emilia is that she isn't a perfect person, a criticism that I have not seen, heard, or read literally anywhere from any notable outlet, influencer, etc. But again, other people are going to go into this more thoroughly, and I kind of want to move on to the other problems. Because the thing is, I was prepared for the representation to be bad. Like, I'd heard from enough people who I trusted, some of whom I know personally, who saw this before I did, and I heard from them, yeah, the trans representation is bad. It gets stuff wrong. It's heavily medicalized. You can tell it was written and directed by a cisgender person. I expected all of that. What I thought would happen when I watched it is that I'm going to watch a competent, if maybe a little bland, just because of the nature of Oscar bait movies, movie that is totally solid, but for some bad representation. What I was not prepared for is that the movie's just bad. Like, as a movie. Or I guess, more specifically, because this is what I'm going to focus on, it's really bad as a musical. Because I haven't mentioned that yet. If you didn't know, this thing is a musical. And it's, the only reason I'm not going to say it's the worst musical that I've seen in years is I also saw Joker Folie à Deux recently. That is actually worse as a musical, but not by as much as it should be. And the extra funny thing about having recently seen Joker Folie à Deux is that there's one specific aspect about it that this movie shares. And that is the fact that both are made by writer-directors who have never made a musical before. And wow, can you tell? Even more than you can tell that this is made by a cisgender person trying to depict a trans person and their life, you can tell even more that this was made by somebody who's never made a musical and doesn't even really appear to understand how they work or why they're usually done the way that they are. Now, for clarity, Jacques Audiard did not write the songs. He wrote the script, the structure is his, and he's the director. The actual songs were written by a singer from France named Camille, who, as best as I can find, would probably be classified as a pop singer. And that's fine. That is a perfectly serviceable skill. But the thing is, being an experienced writer of songs for the radio or even albums is not the same as writing songs for a musical. Knowing how to just write a tune doesn't mean that you understand that the way that these songs are meant to fit into a story or the way that songs usually function to boost that story and tell it better. Now, I guess for clarity, I'm not formally schooled in musical theater or films. That having been said, I am a lifelong theater kid. I have been in more than my share of musicals. I have seen about a dozen professional performances, either from touring companies or on Broadway or even on the West End. I've seen quite a few, and I do enjoy a good movie musical, in addition to enjoying stage musicals and everything else. So while I'm by no means an educated expert in the sense of having specifically academically learned about musicals, I can tell you what I've observed as somebody who watches them a fair bit. Let's actually start with doing a little foundational work and talk about what the purpose of songs in musicals actually is. Now, the nature of songs in musicals has actually kind of evolved as time has gone on, but at this point, and has been the case for a while, to my way of thinking, songs in musicals serve two primary functions. The first is to emphasize the importance of a moment. I don't know the actual origins of this idea, but I remember hearing since probably around high school, the point at which a character in a musical bursts into song is the point at which their feelings, their emotions, their thoughts, or this sense of revelation that they're having is too big to be properly expressed with just words, so they have no choice but to sing. Now, that driving emotion could be love, or fear, or hate, or joy, or despair, or anything. But when it overwhelms them, that is when they start singing. Now, that's sort of the main emotional reason to use them. The other primary way that they are used is as narrative utility because, honestly, they can be really efficient. Songs are an incredibly direct and effective way of getting at the heart of a matter and conveying information that would either take too long to cover through traditional dialogue or would be incredibly clunky to try and convey through traditional dialogue, or both. This is why character introduction songs are so common, because if you're using standard dialogue and interactions, it's pretty awkward to have a character stroll into a scene and promptly declare their name, worldview, and life goals. But in a song? Well, because the character singing already heightens the reality of it all, you can get away with just having them say that stuff. This is the classic I Want song from so many Disney musicals, and it is conveying stuff that it were just to be said outright would be weird and awkward and clunky for characters to do, but for them to sing it, it sells it. I also mentioned it's really efficient, again, partially because it doesn't have to obey the usual rules of standard spoken dialogue, and a really excellent example of that is the song The Family Madrigal from Encanto. Shout out to the commenter Arthur Clybourne Wrights for citing this example in a comment on my Joker 2 video in my secondary channel, because yeah, I did make some of these same points over there. But seriously, think about that song. Between the words and the visuals, it's a little over 4 minutes, and it introduces you to 12 characters by name, explains everybody's superpower, sets up that Bruno's the black sheep, shows the standing the family has in the village, covers a fair amount of the layout of the house that most of this is going to happen in, and gives us an early glimpse of Mirabelle's anxiety at not having a gift by the way that she tries to avoid talking, or rather singing, about herself. Trying to cover all that information and especially trying to do it in the same amount of time through standard dialogue, well, it would feel like the exposition dump that it honestly is. But you couch that in a good song, you don't even realize that you just got exposited to for 4 minutes, because it was delivered in a way that elevates it and presents it in a way that just makes saying things outright work. I suppose you could consider there to be a third way that songs are used in musicals, which is it's just a lot of fun and it's kind of a banger. I would say stuff like Under the Sea falls under that. It's not necessary for the plot, and it's not really a big emotional moment, but it is still a hell of a lot of fun. I'm not going to dwell on those, though, because I think you can only get away with that if most of the rest of the songs are doing the main two things that I'm talking about. So I consider that an exception. We're going to still move forward on the two main things that I've already listed. So these are the two primary ways I see songs being well utilized in musicals. So which way does Emilia Perez use them? Well, neither, really. There is a quality to most of the songs in this movie that I think I can best explain through comparison. Because you see, the things that I laid out about how musical numbers are generally used, that is really kind of applying to movies where there is standard dialogue and interactions and the characters only occasionally burst out into song. You start getting into things where the entire or nearly the entire thing is sung, and the rules get a little murkier, partially because while many of those kinds of shows or movies will still have the big focus musical numbers, there is still singing, often bridging these things. Singing that isn't necessarily in the same vein of like having a key melody or really zeroing in and focusing on a primary aspect or the emotion or what have you, but it's just, here's some filler songs to get us between the bigger songs. That's what you get in stuff like Les Miserables, Sweeney Todd, Phantom of the Opera, amongst others. Now, these kind of bridging songs don't have like the melodies that really stick in your head because they're really just there to be the connective tissue. And it's these in-betweener songs, these bridging songs, these filler pieces of music that the songs in Emilia Perez most closely resemble. And I'll remind you, Emilia Perez is not a movie where it's nothing but singing. It's mostly dialogue. Yet when they sing, it sounds like the stuff you put in between proper songs in something that is all singing. Both in placement and in style, most of these songs sound way more like they're about to lead into something bigger, and then they just don't. They are incredibly repetitive and frequently spend their entire length reiterating the same idea over and over and over again, often literally just repeating the same words. And yes, many songs in musicals or just in general will repeat elements. That's what a chorus is. But when you have it done by people who know what they're doing, that will still build over the course of the song. And even when you circle back to the chorus, each time you do, maybe that meaning will be conveyed a little bit differently, or maybe what you've conveyed in the verses between the chorus will give those same words and notes a different overall feel than they had before, or at least the whole thing will build, and these don't. I think the most succinct way I can demonstrate how the songs fail to do much of anything really is by highlighting the love song. Now, this is a love song between Emilia and the character of Epifania. Now, love songs are a classic. And that is actually one of the ways that a lot of musicals will take advantage of the song format to do things better than they maybe could do without it. Because if you're trying to sell a relationship, honestly, that's hard to do in almost any story where you're not spending the majority of your time on that relationship. Like when romance is the focus, you can take the time to sell us on these characters, what draws them together, get time to build the chemistry and really show the progression of a relationship. But if it's not the main focus and it's kind of a side thing that's going on, that's really hard to sell. It's actually part of the reason why I tend to rail against romantic side plots just as a thing. But when you can do it in a musical, doing it as a song gives you the opportunity to condense it. And the fact that you don't have a lot of time to sell it doesn't become as much of a detriment anymore. Because, first of all, in the song, you can just have people say their emotions and say what they're feeling and say what someone means to them in a way that, again, would probably be clunky to do in dialogue, at least in anything close to the same amount of relatively short time. But also, you can have just the musical chemistry of two people really help sell that connection. That's what a good love song in a musical can do. That's not what this song does. The heart of this song doesn't have these two women singing about why they love each other, what they love about each other, what draws them to each other, what they see in each other. Instead, a rather extended portion of it is just each of them singing the other's name. This tells us nothing. It's flatly failing to make use of what a song could do for you at this point in the story. And the parts of the songs that aren't that, well, it's Emilia doing this whole who even am I thing. And it's a little bit of an odd thing to have that at this point of the movie at all, much less attached to the love song, because this is 2/3 of the way in. She's been living as a woman for years, and we're opening this song with half him, half her. Yeah, she moves on to some other points of juxtaposition after that, crime lord versus philanthropist, her general unease with her tangibly improved life. But when you kick off the song, the supposed love song with the trans character saying half him, half her, I'm sorry, I think that kind of colors and taints the rest of the song. Now, if I was trying to defend this song, maybe I'd point out, okay, I think what it's trying to bring across is that her gender reassignment by itself was not enough to make her happy. That's why she's, trying to reconnect with her family. That's why she's now falling in love and feeling things that feel like for the first time, even though she'd already done the thing that she thought would bring her happiness. And I would say that's all plausible as an interpretation, but then we bump up against the problem that we don't actually have Emilia's perspective and we're viewing her through the lens of cis people, which means we don't have enough insight on her prior to, during, or after this song to be sure that that's what the hell is trying to be communicated right now. What draws these two together? What do they like about each other? What do they do together besides declare their love? I haven't got the first damn clue. And a song is the perfect opportunity to address literally all of that. And honestly, the other songs aren't much better. There is a massive issue of repetition where they don't really build, and it just keeps making the same points over and over again until the movie decides, yeah, that was long enough for a song. Anyway, moving on. The song Bienvenido almost felt like it was going to work for like a half second or so, but after somewhat gratuitous and frankly kind of sleazy feeling shots of Selena Gomez writhing around in her underwear, she then has this anger building in her and she bursts into this other room of intense dancing, and it feels like it's going to be about the contrast between the life she wants and the one she feels trapped in, but it's just kind of not. She just starts endlessly bitching about Emilia and shouting out these single words, and the editing gets choppy until it just stops. One of the other things that might have been a problem with this is that Camille, the writer of the songs, in addition to not being a theater or movie musical composer and having, so far as I could find, no real background in that, at least certainly not in her career, she also, from what I could find, doesn't speak Spanish either. So she had to work with a translator on this as well. Again, I'm not saying you can't depict a culture or even a language you're not familiar with. I'm not trying to limit people as artists, but we've now added, on top of all of the other things, such as a cis writer-director writing a trans woman and making the major decisions on how she is going to be depicted with no experience in musicals, who hired a songwriter who also doesn't have experience in musicals and doesn't even speak the language. I'm not sure if Jacques Audiard actually knew Spanish either. I'm hoping so, given how much is in this, but we're just layering more and more things that shows these people were so far outside their wheelhouses, it's no wonder the whole thing feels floundering. There's really only one song that feels like it was coming close to working, and to the Academy's minuscule credit, it was one of the 2 songs nominated. So the best song of the movie, by a pretty wide margin, is El Mal, sung primarily by Rita. The song is set during a benefit dinner that Emilia is throwing to help raise money for the survivors and victims of cartel violence. This has become Emilia's life work and stands in contrast to her previous life as the head of a cartel. Rita goes through the hall and among the tables, pointing out all the hypocrisy of those present, all the harm they do. It's one of those songs that by necessity is something that is more or less happening only in Rita's perspective, and the movie is sort of sharing the thoughts with the audience that she can't and isn't speaking aloud. And that's a perfectly sound premise for a song. It also clearly had more concerted effort put into the choreography and the filming of it as a musical number than most of the other songs in the movie did. It actually builds decently. It tells us something about Rita's current mental state that we might not otherwise have known. It's just better presented. Just a shame it doesn't really matter. Like the Trans Surgeries musical number before it, it's a lot of spectacle for something that ultimately has no impact. Because, as I said, this is going on in Rita's head. She's not actually confronting any of these people. That doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, except the fact that this is a room full of hypocrites doesn't really come up again, narratively or thematically. Well, I suppose in theory there's one thematic way that you could claim it comes up, but I really hope that they weren't trying to do that, because the only thematic way that any of this is relevant is the contrast of the trans woman as being someone who also isn't what she presents herself as. I really hope that wasn't the thematic link, so giving the benefit of the doubt that that wasn't intended, none of this circles back. The plot at no point hinges on the fact that these people are hypocrites. The fact that this appears to be a point of tension for Rita and could be a conflict point with Emilia, that doesn't even come back. This entire thing, these thoughts, these emotions that are being well delivered by Zoe Saldana don't drive any action from Rita as a character later. This does technically tell us some things about Rita, but it's not anything that the movie or the character are going to do anything with. So they don't matter. And again, maybe the movie could have gotten away with more of this if it just had been sung from start to finish. But when only some parts of it are sung, you're putting a big highlight on the times that you do have them sing. And if those things don't really go anywhere, tell us anything, or matter in the scope of the story, well, it feels like highlighting random passages in a book, or that thing that Frank Miller does in comics, where a bunch of words are in bold font for literally no discernible reason. It's just amateurish. I feel kind of mean using that term for a bunch of clear professionals, but it just is. This thing is just so clearly made by people who don't have enough background in what it is they're trying to do. Not enough background in trans representation, Mexican representation, or musicals as a format. I haven't really talked about the plot, but it is a crime soap opera with delusions of grandeur that has somehow decided that it's going to be Oscar bait. And it's okay to be a cheap soap opera if that's what you want to be, but it's presented with this air of elevation as if it's plumbing some deep emotional depths or truths that aren't being talked about otherwise, and it's just not. Again, a reminder, this is a movie about a drug lord who gets a sex change and then tries to reconnect with the family who doesn't realize who she is. It's a trashy B-grade plot that thinks it's deep. It's an awkward, lumpy amateur hour musical that thinks it's an opera. It's a crass, shallow look at transness that thinks it's breaking new ground when in fact it's wallowing in the tropes and cliches actual queer artists have been trying to move on from for decades. And it's probably gonna win Best Picture. I mean, that's my biggest frustration because honestly, if this wasn't up for a bunch of awards and hadn't already won a bunch of others, I would feel no need to devote this much time to it. I wouldn't. I would just bang out like, what, maybe 15-minute tops for a review in my secondary channel. Because I feel like that's all that this deserves. It's not bad enough in an interesting way even to devote this much time. That was my thought coming away from it. I'm like, I'm going to have to talk about this, but it doesn't deserve to be talked about that much. It's not even harmful to the degree of something like Silence of the Lambs was back in the day. So while the representation isn't good, it is bad in the exact ways that we've been dealing with cisgender people depicting trans people, especially in Oscar bait style movies, for the last 15 years or so. So it's not breaking new ground. It's not interesting. It's not good. It doesn't deserve this much of my time or yours. Except for the fact that it's gonna win Best Picture. It's gonna win, and I'm gonna hate that. In a fair universe, we wouldn't even be talking about this movie, and it would be shuffled into the dustbin of history alongside other failed award bait like Nine, The Majestic, and All the King's Men. Instead, it's going to win Best Picture so that a bunch of industry insiders can convince themselves that they're allies. And it's going to do it while ignoring all the criticism from the very groups that it's depicting, both trans people and Mexican people. And also ignoring the fact that, it's just not a good movie. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but it's not worth any of the attention it's getting. Other than, again, for me at least, the fact that it had a trans woman play her own pre-transition self. I'll not take that away from it. I'm grateful for that. I'll continue to be grateful for that. I'll continue to cite it. But I'm always going to cite it with an asterisk of, it did this, and that's a good thing to do. Don't watch the movie, though. It's not any good. Ugh. I'm not looking forward to the Oscars. I haven't looked forward to the Oscars in ages, but I'm especially not looking forward to them now. I think after this thing wins and some time has passed and some distance, it's going to be considered in the same kind of category as Crash and Green Book. That category of, was there any merit to this thing other than the fact that it was tackling the relevant political topics of the day and not even necessarily doing that well? I feel like that's ultimately how this thing's going to be remembered, if it's much remembered at all. Because, it's worth noting, sometimes even Best Picture winners fade from memory. Anybody still talk about The Artist? Did you even remember that one? I don't know, maybe. I actually never got around to it. Maybe it was good. As long as it was better than this. I don't know. I'm not going to vouch for it, though. But Emilia Perez. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? As I said, a far more thorough breakdown of all the ins and outs of the trans representation that I kind of just bullet pointed for you. You can wait for Jesse Gender's video on that. As I said, I kind of wanted to talk about the rest of it because I was just bowled over at the fact that the rest was bad, especially the musical aspect. Because, oh boy, a bad musical is a special kind of pain. And it's not like all modern musicals are bad. I still haven't seen Wicked yet, but I hear it's very good. I've heard from people who shared my same concerns that I expressed before it came out, and they say it's real good, and I look forward to that. And there are other musicals that I've seen that are really good from the last few years. It can still happen. The medium, the art, the style hasn't degraded. And we're going to award this. Honestly, I kind of understand why it's going to get probably Best Actress, probably Best Picture, but the fact that it got nominated for songs I feel like they just kind of recognize the fact that if they nominate a musical for Best Picture but don't nominate any of the songs from that musical, it looks weird. That's the only justification I can come up with. Because no. Don't really understand how it's possibly up for editing either. But the editing category has been weird, like real weird for the last decade or so. Anyways, the Oscars, Emilia Perez, any of this. What do you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living, even if you can't help me out that way. Like, share, subscribe. You know all the stuff. It's YouTube. You know the YouTube stuff. What I really want you to remember is, whether you've seen this movie or not, and even if you liked this movie, honestly, if you did, I'm happy for you. I would have liked to have watched it and gone, actually, you know what? All the criticisms I'm hearing is wrong, and this is actually really good. It didn't happen, but it would have been nice. But, you know, whatever your thoughts are, I'd be more than happy to hear them. But what I really want you to remember, no matter what you think of this thing or my thoughts on it, you are beautiful. You are valid. And you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Goddess Elida, Zubin Lopfula, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Alistair McPherson, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, White Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Pal Barabajoggle, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. If you'd like me to... I read the names fine, then screwed it up. If you would like to hear me try and say your name while these guys chitter in my ears, check out the rewards on my Patreon. Yeah, you're not distracting at all.